Beltrami, Minnesota, October 1898. The air, sharp with the coming cold, carried the scent of pine resin and curing wood. All around the small government settlement, the sound of progress was the rhythmic thud of an axe, and the scrape of a draw knife on logs destined for proper cabins. But on the northern edge of the clearing near the reindeer pens, Aslak Sirma was making a different sound entirely. It was the quiet, patient sound of bending. With his back to the wind, he worked long, slender birch saplings over a pit of steaming stones, coaxing them into impossible curves. The work was slow, strange, and visible to everyone. It drew stares, then whispers, then open commentary. "What in God's name is the lap building?" asked Bjorn Gunderson, a logger whose arms were as thick as the saplings Aslak was wrestling into submission. He stood with Sven O'Malley, a farmer who had spent the last month chinking his own cabin walls with a mixture of mud and moss. "Looks like a basket," Sven said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near his boot. A big, upside-down basket. Maybe he plans to catch the snow when it falls. Eric Wahlberg, the Bureau of Indian Affairs supply agent, walked over, his ledger tucked under his arm. He was a man who believed in straight lines, right angles, and government specifications. The structure taking shape before him had none of those things. It was a skeleton of 24 curved ribs, all meeting at a central wooden wheel, like some bizarre earthbound spider. He watched Aslak lash a rib to the wheel with a strip of what looked like sinew. "Sirma," Wahlberg called out, his voice carrying the weight of official concern. "The agency provides milled lumber and nails for a reason. That thing. It won't stand up to a Minnesota winter. It's a tent, and a flimsy one at that." Aslak paused, holding a coil of lashing. He looked at the half-finished dome, then back at the BIA agent. "It will be warm," he said, his English spare and precise. He then turned back to his work. The conversation, for him, concluded. Wahlberg shook his head, making a note in his ledger. The government's grand experiment to introduce reindeer husbandry to the Ojibwe via Sami herdsmen was already a delicate affair. The last thing he needed was one of his primary assets freezing to death in a foolish hill of his own making. The mockery lasted through the autumn. The men called it Aslak's Folly, or the sod tent. They couldn't imagine a home without thick, solid log walls. They saw weakness in its curves, madness in its materials. What did this Sami reindeer herder, a man from the top of the world, understand about the physics of rising heat that the experienced log cabin builders of Minnesota had missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival in this brutal, unforgiving landscape, and it would do so with nothing more than sod, wool, and a shape borrowed from the ancient winds of his homeland. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that is as relevant today as it was in 1898. We tell stories about the quiet innovators who solved life or death problems with the materials at hand. To support that mission, please consider subscribing to our channel and letting us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional but effective shelter you've ever seen? Aslak Sirma was not a carpenter. He had never hewn a dovetail joint or raised a gabled roof. He was not a farmer who understood the geometry of plowed fields and straight fences. He was a man of the Vida, the vast, treeless plateaus of Sapmi. His trade was not in wood, but in movement. His tools were not the axe and saw, but the lasso, the herding dog's bark, and the deep, instinctual knowledge of how to live with the wind, not against it. His hands knew the feel of reindeer antler, the tensile strength of birch roots, the insulating power of a dozen different kinds of moss. He was a builder of the goati, the traditional dwelling of his people, a structure born not of aggression against the elements, but of intelligent accommodation to them. He had come to Minnesota with his wife Inga and their two children, 7-year-old Lars and 5-year-old Elena, as part of the ambitious and arguably misguided Beltrami reindeer experiment. The U.S. government, hoping to create a new livelihood for the local Ojibwe, had imported Sami families and their herds to teach the craft. The Sirma family was provided with a standard-issue cabin, a single-room, 16 by 20-foot box of green pine logs, hastily erected and poorly chinked. Their first winter in that cabin was a lesson in misery. It was a cold that was not merely a temperature, but a physical presence. Aslak remembered the specific cruelties of it with a clarity that fueled his work on the dome. The thick leather harness for the lead reindeer, hung on a peg by the door, froze so stiff that when he tried to straighten it one morning, it cracked in two with a sound like a pistol shot. Inga fought a daily battle with the kitchen pump. Its iron handle would squeal with protest and seize solid between strokes, forcing her to thaw it with precious boiled water just to get a bucket for the morning. In the evenings, she would try to mend clothes by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, but the cold made everything brittle. The cotton thread on the spool, stored in a box just a few feet from the stove, would grow stiff and snap at every third or fourth pull of the needle. They burned through their entire winter's allotment of firewood by February, and still, the cold laid siege to their small box. The children slept in their coats, huddled under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air inches from their faces. Aslak knew this was not survival. It was a slow defeat. He would not let his family face another winter in a box designed to leak heat into the sky. The problem with the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of materials, but a failure of geometry and a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. The log cabins of Beltrami were sturdy, honest structures built from the plentiful pine and oak of the region. Men like Bjorn Gunderson could raise a wall in a week, notching the logs with a skill passed down through generations, but they were all building the same flawed machine. A log cabin is a square. Heat, generated by a wood stove, rises. In a box with a high gabled roof, this rising heat, the single most valuable commodity on the frontier, collects uselessly in the peak of the rafters, 30 feet above the floor where the people lived. The air near the ceiling could be a balmy 60 degrees, while at floor level, where children played and families slept, it was a bone-chilling 35 degrees. It was an engine designed to stratify heat, to separate it from the very people who needed it. Furthermore, the walls themselves were thermal sieves. A solid 8-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of about 8. That's roughly the same as a modern double-pane window, but that assumed a perfect seal. In reality, hundreds of feet of chinking between the logs provided a pathway for the cold to creep in. Every winter, the green logs would shrink and twist, opening up dozens of tiny cracks. On a windy night, a settler could watch the flame of a candle flicker and dance from a dozen different drafts. The only solution was to burn more wood, to feed the stove constantly, turning cords of hard-won timber into a rising column of wasted heat that streamed out the chimney and bled through the walls. The neighbors suffered the predictable consequences. Sven O'Malley's wife spent half the winter boiling water to thaw their well pump, a task that consumed firewood that should have been warming their children. The Gunderson family hung blankets over their doorways and windows, creating a small, cramped living space around the stove, effectively abandoning half their cabin to the frost. The ice wasn't just outside, it was an invasive force. It grew in thick, crystalline ferns on the nail heads inside the walls and formed a permanent, quarter-inch layer of rime on the floor in the corners of the room. This was the accepted reality, the price of admission for living in northern Minnesota. It was a war of attrition against the cold, a war everyone was accustomed to losing, slowly. Aslak Sirma had no intention of fighting that war. He planned to make the cold irrelevant. The construction of the goati began in earnest as the autumn leaves turned from gold to brown. Aslak had spent weeks in the surrounding woods, selecting 24 perfectly matched birch saplings, each about 4 inches in diameter at its base. He chose them not for their straightness, but for their flexibility, their willingness to bend. He harvested them with a small hand axe, honoring each one with a quiet word of thanks, a custom of his people. The bending process was the first spectacle for the settlers. He dug a long, shallow trench, filled it with river stones, and built a fire over them for half a day. After sweeping away the coals, he poured water onto the superheated rocks, creating a massive plume of steam. Into this steam bath he laid the birch poles, covered with wet hides to trap the moisture and heat. For hours he tended the process, slowly, patiently, until the wood's tough linen became plastic. Then, using a series of wooden forms driven into the ground, he and Inga carefully bent each pole into a precise, sweeping curve, a quarter-circle arc. They were left to cool and set, holding their new shape permanently. Next came the foundation. He marked out a 14-foot circle on a flat, well-drained piece of ground. There was no digging, no foundation wall. The goati sat upon the land, not in it. The central piece was the bowalu, or king post wheel, a thick circle of carved pine with 24 mortises cut into its edge. Hoisting this 10-foot-high central support was the heaviest part of the work. With the wheel in place, he began the elegant, spider-like process of raising the ribs. Each bent birch pole was set with its base on the ground-level circle, and its tip fitted into a mortise in the king post wheel. As each rib went up, the shape emerged from the earth, not a box, but a perfect dome, a hemisphere of clean, powerful lines. He lashed them all together with rawhide, cinching the structure into a single, unified frame that had both immense strength and a surprising degree of flex. It was during this phase that Eric Wahlberg made his most pointed objection. He arrived one afternoon to see Aslak preparing to stack sawed bricks against the frame. "Sirma, I've been reviewing the supply manifests," Wahlberg began, avoiding any preamble. "You've requisitioned a significant portion of the winter reindeer feed, the lichens and pressed moss cakes. You plan to store them in this?" He gestured at the dome. Aslak nodded. "It will be dry." "Dry?" Wahlberg scoffed, his professionalism giving way to exasperation. "It's a sod house, a tent covered in dirt. The moisture from the ground will wick straight up. The condensation from you and your family breathing will be trapped inside. That feed will be a block of sour, rotten mold by Easter. You'll compromise the entire herd. This is government property." Other settlers echoed the concern. "He's building a root cellar to live in." Ole Magnuson, the settlement's best carpenter, declared to anyone who would listen, "Everything inside will sweat and rot. The blankets, the food, the people." Aslak's response was, as always, maddeningly simple. He pointed to the small 4-inch opening at the very apex of the dome, around the king post. "It will breathe," he said to Wahlberg. Then he turned to Inga, and they began the arduous task of laying the sod. They cut the bricks from the prairie themselves, thick 8-inch deep rectangles of earth and grass roots. They laid them in 2 overlapping layers like immense shingles, starting from the base and working their way up the curved ribs. The weight of the sod, tons of it, locked the frame to the ground, making it immovable even in the fiercest wind. From the outside, it was no longer a basket. It was a living green mound, a small, perfectly formed hill that seemed to have grown naturally from the landscape. The final step was the most foreign to the onlookers. Working from the inside, Aslak and Inga painstakingly stitched a continuous liner made from thick, felted wool blankets, the kind issued by the BIA. They attached the 4-inch thick wool layer directly to the inside of the birch ribs, leaving a small air gap between the wool and the sod. They sealed the smoke vent at the apex with a carefully molded ring of river clay, which could be adjusted with a long pole. The door was a simple reindeer hide, stretched over a wooden frame. When it was finished, the structure was complete. To the settlers of Beltrami, it looked like a burial mound, a temporary, primitive shelter for a people who didn't know how to build a proper house. Inga herself looked at the low, rounded form and said to Aslak in their own tongue, "It does not look proud, my husband." He touched the thick wool lining inside. "It does not need to be proud," he replied. "It needs to be clever." The genius of the goati was not in its brawn, but in its brain. It was a finely tuned thermal machine, and its performance stemmed from a deep understanding of physics that Aslak Sirma knew in his bones, even if he didn't use the scientific terms. The system worked on two primary principles: superior insulation and intelligent heat management. First, the insulation. The settlers' mockery of the sod tent missed the brilliant layering Aslak had created. The outer layer, 8 inches of densely packed sod, was not just dirt. It was a matrix of soil and grass roots, containing millions of tiny air pockets. This gave it an R value of approximately R1 per inch. An 8-inch layer provided an R8 shell, equivalent to a standard log wall. But this was only the first line of defense. The true power came from the inner lining. The 4-inch thick wool blankets were a phenomenal insulator. Wool fibers are naturally crimped, creating a deep, lofty pile that traps vast amounts of air. Dry, compressed wool has an R value of over R3 per inch. Aslak's 4-inch liner provided a continuous, unbroken thermal barrier of R12. Combined, the sod and wool created a composite wall with an R value of R20, more than double that of the best log cabin in the settlement. Crucially, there were no gaps. Unlike a log wall with its hundreds of feet of chinking, the goati's insulation was a monolithic blanket, wrapping the living space in an almost perfect envelope. The small air gap between the sod and the wool served as an additional buffer and a moisture break, preventing the inner warmth from creating condensation on the cold sod, the very problem Wahlberg feared. But the insulation was only half the equation. The true elegance was the dome shape itself. As every frontiersman knew, heat rises. In a square cabin, this natural law, called convection, was a curse. In the goati, it was an asset. The curved walls and ceiling provided no corners or flat rafters for heat to get lost in. Every single British thermal unit, BTU, of heat, from the small fire pit, from the simmering stew pot, from the bodies of the 4 people inside, was gently and inexorably funneled upward by the curving walls toward the apex. This created a large, stable pocket of warm air that filled the top third of the dome. It didn't escape, it pooled. Measurements in similar structures show that the air temperature near the 14-foot-high apex could be a full 14 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the air at floor level. This wasn't wasted heat, it was stored heat. This thermal reservoir acted like a warm cap, slowly and evenly radiating its warmth back down onto the family below. It created a gentle, draft-free environment that a log cabin, with its churning currents of cold and hot air, could never achieve. The adjustable clay vent at the very top allowed Aslak to release just enough moisture and smoke without losing this precious bubble of warmth. He had built a structure that didn't just contain heat, it actively gathered and managed it. That November, the winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, brutal assault. A high-pressure system stalled over the Canadian plains, pulling a vast dome of Arctic air down over Minnesota. The temperature plummeted and stayed there. For 17 consecutive nights, the thermometer outside Eric Wahlberg's BIA office never rose above minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a dry, crystalline cold. Under the atmospheric inversion, the air became super saturated with moisture that had nowhere to go. It began to deposit itself on every available surface, not as frost, but as hoarfrost. Long, delicate 3-inch needles of pure white ice grew on every tree branch, every fence post, every nail head. The world was transformed into a bizarre, beautiful, and deadly sculpture garden of ice. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a nightmare. The cold was a physical predator, finding every chink, every crack. Bjorn Gunderson's mighty log walls seemed to radiate cold inward. His family sealed themselves into the half of the cabin with the stove, but the frost still crept across the floor, and the water bucket froze solid just 10 feet from the fire. Sven O'Malley's prized sow, which had farrowed a week earlier, lost half her litter, the piglets freezing in their sleep, despite being buried in straw. The sound of axes echoed constantly through the frozen air as men worked tirelessly to chop firewood, their breath freezing instantly on their beards and mustaches. They were feeding their stoves around the clock, a desperate, losing battle to pour enough heat into their leaky boxes to keep the killing cold at bay. Inside the small green mound on the edge of the settlement, life continued with an impossible sense of normalcy. The Sirma family's fire was small, a modest collection of glowing birch logs that required feeding only a few times a day. The air inside the goati was still and quiet. There were no drafts. The thick wool walls absorbed sound, creating a peaceful, muffled silence against the shrieking wind outside. The domestic warmth was proven in the smallest details. The air was so consistently warm that Inga was able to bake. She kept a small sourdough starter in a clay pot, and twice during the cold snap the rich, yeasty smell of baking bread filled the dome, a scent of summer and life in the dead of winter. The children, Lars and Alina, could sit on a reindeer hide spread on the floor and practice their letters on a small slate without their fingers growing numb. They wore simple wool sweaters, not their heavy outdoor coats. High up, on a small storage platform built near the warm apex, sat a dozen glass jars. They held Inga's precious cloudberry preserves, a taste of their homeland. In the intense, penetrating cold, any liquid in the other cabins had long since frozen solid. But in the stable pocket of warmth gathered by the dome, the golden preserves remained perfectly clear and liquid. They were a silent, shimmering testament to the structure's success, a small jar of liquid summer held safe in the heart of an Arctic winter. Eric Wahlberg was a man of duty. He was also not a cruel man. As the hoarfrost deepened and the cold entered its second week, his professional concern for his reindeer feed morphed into genuine fear for the Sami family. No tent, no matter how cleverly built, could withstand this. He imagined finding them frozen, a tragedy that would be laid squarely at his feet by his superiors in Washington. He loaded his sleigh with extra blankets and a box of emergency rations, hitched his strongest horse, and drove the 2 miles to the settlement. The cold was astonishing. It bit at any exposed skin with the sting of 1,000 needles. His own mustache was a block of ice within minutes. As he drew near the Sirma's dwelling, he saw no smoke from the smoke hole, and his heart sank. He pulled the sleigh to a stop and walked toward the silent, white-frosted mound. It looked more like a tomb than ever. He pounded his gloved fist on the stiff reindeer hide door. "Sirma! Aslak Sirma!" The hide flap pulled aside, and there stood Aslak, dressed in a simple wool tunic. A wave of still, warm air washed over Wahlberg's face, a shocking contrast to the knife-edge cold he had been breathing. "Wahlberg," Aslak said, his expression calm. "Come in. Your ears are white." Wahlberg stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The transition was jarring. The wind was gone. The brutal, invasive cold was simply absent. The air was cool, not hot, but it was a living cool, not a dead cold. His frozen ears began to ache and tingle as they thawed. He took off his thick gloves, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He looked around the circular space, lit by a small, quietly burning fire and a single oil lamp. He saw Inga grinding something in a bowl, the children playing quietly on a fur rug. His eyes were drawn upward, following the elegant curve of the birch ribs to the woolen ceiling at the apex. He expected to see frost, to feel a downdraft of cold air. Instead, he felt only a gentle, radiant warmth on his face. He was wearing his heaviest goose-down BIA issue vest, a garment designed for the worst possible conditions. Standing there inside this sod hill, he began to feel uncomfortably warm. Without thinking, he unbuttoned the vest, letting the heat out. His gaze fell upon the high storage platform. He saw the row of glass jars, their contents glowing like amber in the lamplight. "Preserves?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Aslak nodded. "Cloudberry. They haven't frozen?" It was less a question than an expression of disbelief. At the agency station, a bottle of ink left on his desk 6 feet from the stove had frozen solid, splitting the glass. Every jar of preserves in their own larder was a garnet hard stone that had to be grated with a cheese grater if you wanted a taste. For an answer, Aslak climbed a small ladder, took one of the jars down and unscrewed the lid. He tipped it. A thick, golden syrup of berries poured smoothly into a wooden bowl. It was perfectly liquid. Wahlberg stared at the pouring preserves, then back up at the woolen ceiling. He finally understood. The mockery, the professional certainty, the lifetime of experience building with logs and right angles. It all dissolved in the face of this simple, impossible fact. He looked at the quiet Sami man who had endured the settlement's ridicule without a word of argument. "Sirma," Wahlberg said, his voice full of a new respect, "you didn't build a hut." He searched for the right word, a word to capture the active, gathering nature of the space. "You built a purse for every scrap of heat." The vindication of Aslak Sirma's goati was quiet but absolute. Word of Wahlberg's visit and his subsequent reversal spread through the settlement. The story of the liquid preserves became a local legend. The mockery stopped, replaced by a grudging, then open curiosity. In late February, a Lutheran missionary named Reverend Strand made his rounds to the Beltrami colony. He was a Norwegian-American who spoke a little of the Sami dialect and was tasked with ministering to the Scandinavian and Sami families on the northern frontier. He had heard the strange tales of the warm hill and made a point to visit the Sirma family. He too was a skeptic, a man who believed a proper Christian family lived in a proper house with straight walls. He stayed with the Sirma family for 2 days, and he left a convert. He was amazed not just by the warmth, but by the quality of the air. It was dry and fresh, with no hint of the dampness or rot he had expected from a sod structure. He spent hours with Aslak, asking questions, meticulously sketching the structure in his pastoral diary. He drew the king post wheel, noting the number and angle of the mortises. He sketched the lashing patterns for the ribs. He made detailed cross-section drawings of the wall, labeling the layers: outer, 8 inches prairie sod, root mat intact, frame, bent birch sapling, inner, 4 inches wool blanket, goved issue. Note, air gap essential. That spring, Reverend Strand's duties took him to other small, scattered communities where Sami families had settled. In his sermons and social calls, he spoke of the Beltrami goati. He shared his sketches with families struggling in drafty shacks and cabins. The drawings, coming from a man of God and backed by the undeniable proof of survival, carried immense authority. The design wasn't a government blueprint. It was a piece of inherited wisdom, passed through a trusted cultural network. By the autumn of 1899, the idea had taken root. In two small Sami enclaves in northern Wisconsin and another near the Minnesota border, families began building their own variations of the goati. They adapted the design using peeled pine poles where birch was scarce, but they adhered to the core principles: the dome shape, the heavy outer mass, and the thick inner layer of insulation. Aslak's knowledge, once an object of ridicule, was now a blueprint for survival, spreading quietly from one family to another, carried in the pages of a missionary's diary. The principles Aslak Sirma deployed in 1898 were so effective they would not be independently rediscovered and codified by mainstream building science for another 70 years. The Beltrami goati was, in modern terms, a masterpiece of sustainable and resilient design. The 8-inch sod shell was not just insulation, it was a massive thermal battery. Throughout a sunny winter day, the dark earth would absorb solar radiation, slowly warming up. At night, it would release that stored heat back into the living space, stabilizing the temperature. This concept, known today as thermal mass, is a cornerstone of passive solar design. The unbroken 4-inch wool lining was a form of what is now called super insulation, the practice of wrapping a structure in a thick, continuous thermal envelope to dramatically reduce heat loss. The airtightness Aslak achieved, sealed by the heavy sod and the single adjustable vent, anticipated the principles of modern air sealing and controlled ventilation, which are critical for energy-efficient homes. The dome shape itself is famously efficient, enclosing the maximum volume with the minimum surface area, reducing the amount of exterior wall through which heat can escape. Aslak Sirma, with knowledge passed down through generations of reindeer herders, had built a high-performance home that met standards of efficiency architects would strive for in the wake of the 1970s energy crisis. He was a century ahead of his time. There is a profound difference between a fortress and a home. The log cabins of the American frontier were fortresses. They were built with an adversarial mindset: thick, heavy walls to fight the wind, a steep roof to battle the snow, a roaring fire to wage war against the cold. They were monuments to human labor, standing in rigid, defiant opposition to the natural world. But it was a war they could never truly win, a constant struggle that consumed immense resources of fuel and energy just to achieve a minimal level of comfort. Aslak Sirma did not build a fortress. His goati did not fight the winter, it outsmarted it. It was a structure born of observation and humility. It understood that the most powerful force in winter was not the cold, but the inexorable rise of heat. While his neighbors built boxes that threw their precious warmth away, he built a vessel designed to capture it. The dome did not stand against the sky, it mirrored it, creating its own small, warm atmosphere within. It was a quiet lesson in physics and philosophy, written in birch and sod on the Minnesota prairie. He didn't just shelter his family from the cold world outside. He taught the dome how to gather every wisp of heat they threw upward, turning the breath from their lungs and the steam from their kettle into a shield against the 50 below. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet ingenuity. If you found the science and history compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten innovators. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technologies still rely on the ancient principles of insulation and thermal mass? We appreciate your support. The reconstructions and events depicted in this video are inspired by historical practices and are presented for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized. The building techniques are based on real historical principles, but any modern application should be undertaken with professional guidance and in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.